Well, good afternoon, everybody on the task force. My name is Doug. I'm with the department, and we'll get started here in just a second. I just want you to know this is being live streamed. Obviously, we have media here as well. For the best audio purposes, if you want to say something, you want to be heard well, come on up here. Understand if it's just a small something you want to say around the table, that's up to you if you want to even come up here. But if you're making any kind of statements or any length, please come up here. Mike Kurtenbach and Superintendent Horn will also be speaking from the podium so that we get the best possible audio for all those who are looking in or here in the building. So with that out of the way, I'm going to say hello to Superintendent Tom Horn. And we have a presentation for an outstanding school resource officer. Horn.
How you doing?
Good.
If you will accept, the mics are always the boss. So we're going to start with a recognition. We have a school resource officer who was chosen as the National School Resource Officer of the Month, national. So I'm going to ask Officer Rhodes to come up, please.
It's not me. Sorry.
How are you doing?
Attempting.
We were better off before technology.
I tell you.
Just yell really loud.
Okay.
Are you set?
I think so.
It's working? Okay, come sit. Okay, I am proud to introduce Officer Valerie Rhodes. She is a Phoenix police officer serving as a school resource officer at Barry Goldwater High School in the Deer Valley School District. Officer Rhodes was named School Resource Officer of the Month for November by the National Association of School Resource Officers. That's quite an achievement. Current school board member Ann Ordway started a giving closet at Barry Goldwater a few years ago to provide meals, clothes, and other essentials to students in need at the Title I school. In her first year at the school, Officer Rhodes recognized the need for a new updated space for the giving closet. She asked for help renovating the more user-friendly space from Toll Brothers and Younger Brothers. Costco, Sanderson Ford, and Home Depot have also contributed to the effort. The initiative demonstrates how SROs are valuable school community members, in addition to ensuring school safety on campus. We would like to honor Officer Rhodes for her dedication. To that end, I would like to read this proclamation. This proclamation is for you. Whereas Officer Rhodes has been a dedicated and trusted figure in the Barry Goldwater High School community, ensuring the safety and security of students and staff. Whereas Officer Rhodes demonstrated exemplary commitment by enhancing the giving closet for her school community by collaborating with local partners, resulting in an elevated experience for students. Whereas Officer Rhodes has demonstrated exceptional professionalism, integrity, and compassion in her role as a school resource officer. Whereas Officer Rhodes has gone above and beyond her duties to foster positive relationships between law enforcement and the North Phoenix community. Now, therefore, I, Tom Horn, Arizona Superintendent of Public Instruction, do hereby on December 7, 2023, recognize Officer Rhodes for her outstanding service as a school resource officer at Barry Goldwater High School. I express my heartfelt gratitude for her dedication, commitment, and contributions towards maintaining a safe and nurturing educational environment. I encourage all Arizonans to join me in recognizing her achievements. Congratulations. If you would hold this up, if anybody wants to take any pictures. Okay, so congratulations again. We really appreciate you. And I've got a fancy folder for you to put that.
Yeah.
And now I
Can
turn it
can I
over to
say a
my,
couple of words
oh,
about the officer?
yes, I'm sorry. We have somebody
Thank you.
else to
That's all
talk about.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Ann O'Brien, and I'm a councilwoman in the city of Phoenix. I'm also a recovering school board member from Deer Valley Unified School District, where I was pleased to serve for 8 years. And what many community members don't realize about some of our schools, much like Barry Goldwater High School, is that we have students who often show up hungry and in the need of clothes so that they fit in with their peers. And while this giving closet was started by a fellow school board member, Ann Ordway, I want to say that what SRO Roads did to take this to the next level for those kids so that they could be served with dignity and receive the items they need, clothes, toiletries, and not just clothes for everyday school, but it's also an opportunity for them to get clothes for a special occasion or an interview for a job. And so what she did to bring together all of those businesses, as well as community volunteers and student volunteers, was really going above and beyond the everyday duty of anybody that works in our police department or in our schools. And so I cannot thank you enough for giving dignity to those students who need it most, because without that, it is impossible for them to learn what we need them to learn so that they can go on and have productive, healthy lives as adults. And so it's really just beyond commendable what you did for those students. And I'd love to thank you and give you a hug.
Congratulations again, Valerie. So I'm going to turn this over to Mike Kirkenbach. Those who I understand, this is our final report, and committee, the representative of each of our committees that have worked very hard, for which I'm very grateful to them, will report the conclusions of their committee. When you do that, please come up here so that we'll have a good record of the final report. And so I'll turn this over to Mike Kirkenbach.
Thank you, Superintendent Horn. As the superintendent said, my name is Mike Kurtenbach, Director of School Safety here at the Arizona Department of Education. And before I begin with the program, I just want to echo what the superintendent said and Councilman O'Brien. Officer Rhodes represents everything that is good about the School Resource Officer program. And as somebody who wore the Phoenix PD uniform for well over 30 years, it makes me feel especially warm inside to see her doing what she's doing for our community. So with that said, rather than provide a traditional PowerPoint, the task force members have a hard copy of the PowerPoint in front of them. For explanation, it makes it difficult for our Zoom members if we have the PowerPoint up on the screen. So I'm going to go over some of our key points, and I may call on some of the task force members to provide some clarity, or if I'm misrepresenting something or misstating something, please don't be shy about jumping in. So one of the things that this group has done is we met as a task force. This is our third meeting. The task force itself was divided into 3 separate working groups as well. One that was focused on operations and staffing, a second on training, and then another on funding. Those working groups have met 3 times each as well. So this has not been taken lightly. Everyone has provided tremendous feedback, and there are several salient points that I'm going to discuss today. The first, there's been a lot of discussion about how do we get school resource officers in schools when there clearly is a need that outstrips the ability and the capacity to provide officers. To provide context, Superintendent Horn awarded 301 school resource officers grants throughout the state. Unfortunately, as we took a look at this just a couple of months ago, there were 138 of those schools that were left unfilled. So we've come up with some creative measures to try and bridge that gap through a partnership with a third-party vendor using school safety program funds. But it's debatable whether or not that is a sustainable long-term solution. So one of the things we've looked at is retirees. With that, bringing back retirees such as myself, somebody who just left the Phoenix Police Department in February, I'd like to think that I still have the ability to work in a school if I was so inclined to do so. How do we create a pathway for those retirees? And there's been a lot of discussion around the public safety retirement system and whether or not what we propose would run afoul of that. So with that, we are going to start with a brief presentation from on the public safety retirement system to see if there's a way that we can rather seamlessly and efficiently bring back retirees. Bobby?
Well, we're actually tracking 10 minutes ahead of schedule. So PSPRS is set to be on at about 1:50. So if we wanted to go into some of the other recommendations and then come back to that, we're just 10 minutes ahead of schedule this afternoon.
Flexibility is key, Bobby. So yeah, we have other stuff to cover. So there's some time, I'll do that and we'll come back to PSPRS.
And I'll alert you when they enter the Zoom lobby and are ready to go.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
So for those of you that aren't aware, the school safety program is governed by Arizona Revised Statutes, Chapter 15, Section 154. And that statute is very clear that the school safety program funds positions, 4 specific categories of positions: school resource officer, juvenile probation officer, school counselor, and school social worker. What the task force and the working groups identified very clearly, however, is that there are needs beyond those 4 groups. So we're proposing a change to 15-154, one that I have to give credit to State Representative Pollack for bringing forward to the committee, to include school psychologists, and then also what came out of the working groups and the task force to add language around school safety officers. And let me make the differentiation about school safety officers. I just touched upon the fact that there aren't enough dedicated full-time school resource officers to work in these schools. I provided the number 138 short statewide. And that represents 11 of our 15 counties in the state of Arizona. So we have sworn officers that have other jobs that with the appropriate training, we believe we can put them in schools to bridge that gap. And we call them school safety officers. Does a school safety officer have the same training as Officer Steve Dew, who works as a full-time school resource officer? No. But we are providing foundational training from the team here at the Arizona Department of Education that equips them with the tools to work in schools. It helps them to create those connections and those partnerships, and also to provide that resource to those schools that have asked for one. To be very clear, what we did is we sent out communication email to all the schools that had applied for an officer, weren't able to get one through no fault of their own, and afforded them the opportunity to opt into this model. So the legislative change would include, again, in 15-154, language around school psychologists and school safety officers. Additionally, and with that, particularly with regard to law enforcement, there was significant discussion about ensuring that officers that work in schools have the requisite training to work in that environment. All police officers have extensive amounts of training, approximately 660 minimum hours of basic training. Most agencies go far above that. Then you have months of training after basic training, field training, and you're continually learning. I'll say that as somebody who spent over 32 years with the Phoenix Police Department. I was always learning. But there are certain things that are very unique to the school environment that an officer who is working perhaps third shift in Maryvale doesn't have that exposure. Even our school resource officers, as much training as they receive. So with that, we want to add language to 154, and I'll read it specifically, that says that we would develop a plan to train school resource officers or juvenile probation officers in FERPA, civil rights, and adolescent mental health issues. And these are deliberately written broadly, understanding that specific issues can change from year to year, but it's ensuring that our officers have current training that equips them to work in that environment. So they understand what an IEP is, so they understand how to work collaboratively with social workers, with counselors, with school psychologists who are already on campus, perhaps not funded through the school safety program funds. It's all about ensuring that these officers represent a multi-tier system of support and provide those respective supports in collaboration with the professionals. Next subject is a mental health professional manual. Right now, there is a very prescriptive, lengthy, 50-page long school resource officer manual. Officer Dew can tell you from personal experience. Matt Giordano can tell you from personal experience as well. There's a lot of reporting that school resource officers are required to submit to the Arizona Department of Education. Prior to my arrival in this role, I noted that we didn't have such a document for our counselors and our social workers. And I think it's critically important as a state agency that we be stewards of tax dollars to ensure that we provide framework for that. So my team has developed a manual already that touches upon several areas, but I think there's opportunities to improve that and to codify that within the state legislation. I alluded to it earlier. The manual currently includes tiered supports. It addresses building community partnerships, comprehensive school mental health systems. And although we will sunset the task force today, there have been relationships that have been formed through this task force that will continue to be working groups to ensure that we continually refine the products that we are proposing. So with this, the proposed change to the legislation would include, as I said, it's already there, a school safety program established by this section shall include a school safety program guidance manual and mental health professionals guidance manual that incorporates a multidisciplinary safety approach. Next, there was a discussion about expanding 154 beyond mere positions. I said in the very first meeting, and those of you that were here heard me say it, that in a perfect world, I would love to see a menu where every school in the state of Arizona can have all of their needs met. Perhaps every school would want a police officer, a juvenile probation officer, a counselor, a social worker. Now, as we expand this, if we have the opportunity to do so, a school psychologist. But we want to make sure that all of those needs are met. Beyond that, what I've heard very clearly in my position, in the school safety position, is there is a desire to expand the funding to include other needs, particularly around physical safety at school, including architecture, maybe some changes there, design features, and school safety technology. Technology has grown immensely. There are artificial intelligence systems out there that can detect weapons before the human eye can. There are other school safety platforms that exist that are currently in schools, but we believe that it makes sense. The task force recommends that it would make sense to include that in the legislation to, again, provide those schools, those school districts, another tool to enhance safety in their respective schools. I want to give Senator Alston credit for really talking about this, talking about some of the physical changes that have occurred in Phoenix Union and elsewhere. You may have seen a story last week about Mesa. Mesa has incorporated technology, both metal detectors and vape detectors that exist that they believe enhances their safety. This would be an opportunity to just include an additional tool in that proverbial tool belt for our schools. That's specific to legislation, but also there's a role that ADE can play in terms of school safety program guidance that we are committed to. And that is ensuring that we provide a list of supplementary training and training materials to all of our schools. As I said, this isn't meant to be a one-size-fits-all model. We represent all 15 counties. As I had the opportunity recently to go down to Cochise County, to go down to Naco and see the needs that are in a border town such as Naco, those are different than what we see up here. As I've been up to northern Arizona and Coconino and elsewhere, we want to ensure that we, the Arizona Department of Education, provide the appropriate resources to those schools that meet them where they are at. So providing those training materials to the school safety teams, access to additional resources and best practices. We're committed to holding an at minimum annual meeting where we bring all the partners together to share those practices that are working, to seek perhaps opportunities for improvement where those might exist, to collaborate for the betterment of our students and for the betterment of our schools, and to pursue additional partnerships and to leverage existing relationships where we can, so that we can increase the pipeline for our school counselors and our school social workers. I touched earlier upon the 138 schools that applied for a school resource officer but didn't get that officer. Conversely, there were 566 awards for a school counselor or a school social worker, with the most recent data showing 148 of those remain unfilled. And as we've talked with the Social Workers Association, as we've talked with Tina Culbertson representing the counselors, we think that there's a great opportunity to pool our collective resources, those relationships perhaps with Arizona State and other institutions of higher learning, to provide pathways to get more counselors and social workers into our schools to meet those needs. It's all about finding that creativity, that collaboration and ways to meet the needs, as I said before, of our schools. Bobby, I think I see that Diane has signed on.
Yes. If you'd like. There's Diane.
I think this would be a perfect opportunity. Diane, I know you just signed on, but we're at a spot where we've talked about PSPRS, we've talked about getting retirees that have a passion for working in a school environment back into the schools. And I would just like to give you an opportunity to maybe expound upon that issue and to provide some education for everybody in the room. You're still muted on our end, Diane. Give us just a second.
Why don't you try again, Diane, if you can hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you now. Sorry about that, but you're live and we can hear you.
No worries. So for those who don't know me, my name is Diana Callister. I'm a partner at Public Policy Partners. We represent PSPRS at the legislature. So I have had multiple conversations around the return to work, and the SRO issue is one that has come up recently on wanting to make sure that we have enough individuals who are qualified to fill those positions, and retirees has been one of those solutions. And how to accomplish that has been something that I believe have been being talked about in multiple different forums, yours being one of them, and Melissa Taylor and Mike and Bobby and I connected recently to talk through kind of what's currently allowed and what we might be able to do this legislative session by we, I mean, you guys, and then us not getting in the way, but on kind of how to approach that. One of the things that have been talked about is we currently have 38849, it's basically our return to work statutes that allows for people to come back in certain scenarios. And we currently have fire investigators or fire inspectors and arson investigators separately identified as, if you come back hired as one of those positions, that 60-day or 6-month provision that the IRS requires does not apply. And so school resource officers or school safety officers could be added to that, but that would be a legislative change. But I think from in the middle of that conversation, and I don't think that you would get pushback from the pension system or others in that regard, but in the middle of that kind of conversation, I think that, you know, giving some backstory on why that's there is important for everyone to understand. It's not just a PSPRS guideline that you have to wait 6 months before you come back to work, or that you have to have the 60-day window or the 60 days without then an open competitive process. It's an IRS requirement to have a bona fide separation of service. And that is to say you retired, you did not have plans to come back and work, like you cannot have a prearranged employment agreement. And then, you know, retirement wasn't for you, whatever it was, and you came back and you got a job. But that is something that's required by the IRS. If you come back inside that time, you have to have your pension suspended while you're working. But in PSPRS, we're a little different than ASRS, which might be the pension plan that a lot of people that in the room might be familiar with. PSPRS is a multi-employer plan. We are not a pooled system. In Tier 3, we do have a small employer pool, but how PSPRS works, it's a multi-employer plan. So if you retire from the city of Phoenix and you go work for a school district, or you go work for the city of Mesa for that reason, you can retire on a Friday and go back to work on a Monday. And that is not a violation of that IRS requirement because it is viewed as a new job. You went and got a new job. It wasn't, so you have a termination service, you got a new job. That is allowed. And so from my understanding, some of the scenarios that currently are happening for school resource officers are people are retiring and then going and either working for a new employer or being an independent contractor to go through. That is currently allowed in state statute right now. So they don't have to have that 60 days that they couldn't come and be a school resource officer. The relationship that the city may have on allowing uniform to be used or anything along those lines, is not a concern to the IRS, nor is it a concern to PSPRS. Who is viewed as the employer is what actually is a concern to us. Because if we allow for something in our statutes that is not up to the IRS codes, we actually put the entire system tax exempt status at risk. So that's why we were very careful about our return to work statutes. But an SRO officer or SSO officer, depending on how you use it, that is a very different job than your normal, rank and file police officer. So just like a fire investigator and arson investigator would be. So we could put that as a different delineation, but it couldn't be that they were fired from being a full-time school resource officer and going back and doing that. So if they left the city of Phoenix and then did that as an independent contractor, not a problem. But city of Phoenix couldn't rehire them the next day. They could have them outside as well because that employer would not have changed. But I'm happy to answer questions, or Mike, if I missed something from our conversation, just let me know.
No, Diane, I think you did a great job of really breaking this down for us. So just to provide additional context so everybody understands, I'll use Officer Dew as an example. He's an employee of the Chandler Police Department. He has a tremendous relationship at his school. What we heard throughout the meetings was that when he decides he wants to retire, he has the right to do that. But perhaps he wants to retire from his full-time employment but continue to work as a school resource officer. If he continued, as Diane said, as a Chandler police employee, that's not permitted. But one of our issues is that you have the certification and you have a sponsoring agency. So the delineation is, if he was able to work as an independent contractor, perhaps through this third-party relationship that we have currently, and his agency agreed to allow him to work in what we would classify as a reserve status. So he's not a career officer. He leaves as a career officer. He now comes back in the same uniform with the same radio, so he has communications. He has the same skill set, but he's paid differently by a different employer. That's permissible. And that's what we're trying to find ways to tap into that talent. And I will tell you that I've had conversations with multiple agencies around the state that are not necessarily in this scenario, but it could be of using reserve officers in this capacity. Because career officers, the staffing is so low in so many agencies, and there are so many competing needs, chiefs and sheriffs are put in very difficult positions, making hard decisions about which positions they staff. But if you have a reserve officer who spent 20 plus years as a career officer, has a heart for working in schools, wants to work with kids, wants to work in this multidisciplinary system, this is a pathway to allow that to happen. Matt or Steve, did I represent that okay? Any other questions for me or for Diane about that? Or Diane, anything else that you would like to add?
The only thing I'd say is if you wanted to go in that scenario, if the person wanted to go back 6 months later and went through a competitive process and was rehired by Chandler, and to have that as their employer to be the school resource officer, that would be allowed after that 6 months. Or if the statutes were changed to be hired directly as a school resource officer through your normal agency, that would be after the general effective date of any legislation that passed.
Thank you, Diane. And Mayor Nichols, I see you up there. We talked about PSPRS and PSPRS implications, certainly not wanting to burden the fund any further. Hopefully this meets the spirit of what we had talked about. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add to that conversation, sir.
No, I think as long as we're thinking it through, we get to whatever legislative change we need to get through. I think that's good. But no, I appreciate the presentation on it, because it's a delicate thing, and we want to make sure we provide for our men and women in blue. But we also have to have this other obligation we need too for our schools. So I appreciate the conversation quite a bit.
Thank you, Mayor. That concludes the presentation. I don't know if there's any task force members that had any items that they wanted to bring forward. I'll start within the room. Virtually, if any of our virtual members have anything that they would like to add. Well, thank you. I'll take that as a compliment that I covered the material that we were supposed to cover. What's that, sir? Oh, yes. So But before I open it up to the press for any questions that they may have, for all of the task force members, for those of you here in person before you leave, the superintendent has been gracious enough to provide a certificate of appreciation for your work. For those of you that are virtual, we'll get those out to you. And I thank everybody for your work. I just want to be clear, while the task force itself is ending today, the work is far from ending. These relationships that have been forged, the partnerships that have been created, the accountability measures that are in place exist to ensure that we move forward with the recommendations that have come out of this body, that we work with the legislature to enact legislative changes where there's opportunity to do so, and to continue to enhance safety in our schools. So with that, as the superintendent said, if there are any questions, I'll open it up to questions in the room. Yes, sir.
Hi. Sorry, Howard Fisher, Capital Media Services. In between all of this, in terms of shortage of SSOs and counselors.
Howie, okay, I'm sorry, Howie. I got an instruction to come stand next to Mike.
Oh, geez. Because he can't say anything unless you whisper in his ear as his counsel.
I won't do that. If I say anything, I'll say it out loud.
The question becomes in terms of the shortages. Is this money? Is this unqualified people who are not qualified to be either SROs or SSOs? Is it that the districts don't have the cash, the cities that furnish them don't have the cash, or that somehow Tom Horn needs more money to provide these? I'm trying to understand the nexus of what created the problem in the first place.
So it's not a money issue. I will say that as it relates to hiring school resource officers, counselors, and social workers. The money is there. The legislature provided the funds. This past year, we had the opportunity to distribute $84 million. 80 was the allocation and $4 million of carryover. The challenge is finding qualified staff to fill those positions. And I'll give you an example. The agency that I came from, Phoenix PD, at its peak, it was staffed at 3,388 filled sworn positions, 3,388. It's below 2,600 now. Last I saw was 2,571 was the last number I saw. They just had a graduation, so I trust that it changed a little bit. But that delta is where what I talked about, how you have chiefs, you have sheriffs that are having to make very hard decisions. If you're 700-800 officers down, or when we talk about economies of scale, it could be 2 or 3, depending on the size of your agency. You have to make very hard decisions. And every chief, every sheriff recognizes that their first duty is to respond to calls for service. When somebody picks up the phone and they call. I mean, ideally we prevent crime before it happens. I say we. Crime is prevented before it happens, but that's why. It's not a funding issue. It's finding the people to fill these positions. That's the challenge.
Yeah, and let me just add, we had a big shortfall. We funded positions that schools couldn't fill because the local police departments couldn't spare people to do it. And so Mike came up with a very creative solution, which was to contract with an agency that places police officers for off-duty work, such as private construction needing security, churches, and so on. And so now, through those private agencies, police officers who want to work on one of their days off can come to a school. And so if we have 5 like that, we can fill a week so that there's never a time when they're not guarded. And so that is solving the problem now, but it's a short-term solution, not a long-term solution. And retired police officers would be a perfect solution because they've already been trained. They already know. They'd be excellent people in the schools. But they lose, excuse me. But when they retire, they lose their certification. And the legislation says you have to be certified. So we're going to try to amend that.
Mike, let me follow up on that. So if we're creating this position of SSOs, we're taking people who are retired officers, and as you say, we're going to go out and work third shift and hang around the mall, whatever. I talked to him about FERPA, everything else. What exactly more do they need to make them more appropriate as opposed to just a cop in a school?
So we've had a lot of conversations with Director Giordano, who represents the Arizona Peace Officer Standards and Training Board, about what does that look like. So as the superintendent said, and like I said, I believe that our retirees have skills to go work in there, but I think it's dependent on how long they've been separated. And then we've had other conversation about what used to exist previously, a limited authority peace officer status in the state of Arizona. And we talked about it in the task force of, well, then what do you take out? Of that over 600 hours of basic training, what would you take out? Because just because an officer, I don't think, we know Officer Do because of the position that he holds, but if he goes off campus to get a cup of coffee as he's driving to or from campus, he's a police officer. There's gonna be an expectation that he take enforcement action. So we moved away from that, but then we'd have to work closely, and we're committed to working closely with Post to identify what training would be needed for an officer post-separation, after separating from law enforcement. I think it's going to be dependent upon how long they've been gone.
But I guess my question is less the post-separation. There's an old saying that if you're a hammer, you see everything as a nail. If you were a sworn officer looking for felons, you see people, you see situations where it's a problem, put the person in cuffs, put them in the back of the car, maybe take them downtown. Schools are very different places. And I think people keep talking about the school to prison pipeline because they're afraid that, too, quote unquote, too many cops in schools, that's what will lead to. So what needs to change? What does an officer need different? A retired officer who may have 20 years on the job, I use the old term walking the beat because that's how far back I go, versus being an SSO in a school and being more of a counselor or something.
So I do want to address one thing, the school to prison pipeline. The Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency and Prevention recently reported that juvenile arrests are at a 40-year low. So I just want to get that out there because there's a lot of talk about if you have an officer in school, that's going to further this proverbial school to prison pipeline. Training is key. I will tell you, as a longtime practitioner, officers are not inclined to slap cuffs on people and put them in jail. And I will tell you, certainly now with staffing as low as it is, they're problem solvers. They're trying to find ways to create solutions to problems that exist. It could result in arrest. If it's a violation of state law that rises to that level, it could be a referral depending on the age of the individual. But I talked a little bit about, in what the superintendent said, when we discuss the off-duty model, if you think about it for a minute, schools are open during the day, during the week. Generally speaking, as you get more seniority in law enforcement, you tend to migrate toward working the day with weekends off. So what officers are you going to have? I think kind of to your point, and I'll bring this to the retirees as well, what officers are you going to have that are working off duty in schools? That third shift officer that has weekdays off. So that's where we've committed, and we've developed a curriculum here at the Arizona Department of Education to provide starting 8 hours of foundational learning for those things. And I say this simplistically, what are those things that could get an officer in trouble in a school environment that maybe he or she doesn't see out on the beat? So making them aware of that. The Phoenix Police Department has taken that a step farther. They're providing their school safety officers 16 hours of training. So this is going above and beyond what is in the basic training through the academies, what's happening in field training, and then through experience. It's educating our officers that are working in the school environment about the school environment, what those reporting requirements are, the relationships, working with counselors, working with social workers. And then how we take this a step farther, taking those classes, taking that coursework, taking those lessons learned, and then building a curriculum for retirees.
Could I add to that? Howie, I worked very hard to urge schools to put police officers in the schools, keep our kids safe, and do the other things, develop better attitudes, better relationships. And I've encountered opposition from people to say they don't want a school to prison pipeline. And I have very little patience for those people, because what they're really saying is people should be able to violate the law without consequence. A student who brings a gun to school is creating a lot of danger. A student who brings drugs to school to sell is hurting other students and their ability to learn. And I think the idea that people should be able to, and we have had this problems with some school boards. the idea that people should be able to break the law and not have consequence, I think is partly what's wrong with our society today.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Mark Phillips from ABC 15. I'm going to try to ask this question from the perspective of a parent. There's 138 school districts that asked for a school resource officer and couldn't get it because there was nobody available. So what are you going to do? So next year, there's a school resource officer. Do you have to go to the legislature, ask them to make changes to retirements, police retirements that make them more easily available to take on these jobs? What is the demand among retired police officers to fill these positions? What do you have to do so next year, every school that wants a school resource officer gets it?
So we are seeking legislative changes that would provide us, we believe, long-term solutions.
Can you spell out what those are?
So that's allowing the retirees, it goes back to the PSPRS discussion of being able to come back and work in the school, taking somebody who maybe like me has been gone, I'm gone less than a year, but maybe somebody who's been gone a little bit longer. What training does an officer need then to go work in a school environment as a retiree? The question that was asked before by Howie, is this a funding issue? As of today, it's not a funding issue, it's a resource issue. I will tell you that a lot of retirees work as reserve officers, career officers who transition to reserve for the express purpose of working off duty to defray the cost of health care post-retirement. That's a reality. Phoenix has a very robust reserve program. A lot of our sheriffs and other police departments have these programs. So I've talked with a number of these agencies, and Chief Spivey, who is the head of the Arizona Association of Chiefs of Police, has given me the forum, as has Sheriff Rhodes with the Sheriff's Association, to reach out to maybe folks that are contemplating retirement, to legislatively create this long-term pathway that they could just transition into this job. I think that would be ideal. The short term is what the superintendent talked about, working with this third-party vendor to take unused school safety program funds at those schools that asked for a school resource officer to get current full authority peace officers in those schools in an off-duty capacity. So we're addressing it twofold. We're trying to look for the long-term legislative solution, while in the short term, getting off-duty officers in the schools, but providing the training before they go into the schools.
Maybe you can tell them how many we've already filled of those. He used a figure of 100 and some that were not filled.
Yes, sir. So what we did, again, and there's a principal that's in the room here today that we heard very clearly, it's one of the drivers for that, of getting creative to get safety in school, getting officers in schools. We sent email communication out to the 138 schools. And I want to make a distinction. This is really important that everybody understand. The school safety program is a 3-year grant cycle. By statute, it closes February 15th or April 15th, rather, of this year. So we said, if a school were to opt into this model, they're only opting in for this school year, meaning off-duty. So you couldn't get an officer in the 138 schools. You're electing for off-duty. You would have that off-duty officer for this year. That resets then comes 7/1 of 24. That if an agency gets healthier, if there's an opportunity now to have a full-time SRO, they can, because the funding has already been awarded, go back into the SRO program. We're just trying to bridge that gap in the short term. We've had 58 schools of that 138 already say yes. We've had a lot of them say, we're really hoping that our home agency will give us an officer. And we're working with them to hopefully by 12/31 make a decision. We're encouraging them to talk to that agency, see if there is an opportunity to get an officer this school year.
Mr. Horn, if I could follow up with you.
Yeah.
You've written a bunch of laws. What specifically, when you sit down with lawmakers, spell out the bill that you want that succeed, that gets what you need?
Okay, I'll tell you what comes to mind, and Mike can correct me, but we need to have some kind of licensing situation whereby if people are retired, they're no longer certified, they can get recertified for the purpose of being school resource officers. Right now, they can't do that, and that's irrational. That should be an easy yes from any reasonable legislator, I would think. And a lot of these, you need to know, these recommendations that are being made from committee work that included equal number of Democrats and equal number of Republican legislators. So we've been we have legislators from both parties as part of that process. I think that that was the main thing. And what was the other part of that, Mike?
Well, there's
Yeah.
there's two pieces that you have to have. You have to have the certification. So I'm still certified by the Arizona Peace Officer and Standards Training Board. I don't have a sponsoring agency right now. I need those two things. That's for my situation as a retiree. So then an agency would have to take me on, I would say, with appropriate training to be recognized by post, whatever that training is. And then I can wear that uniform, I wear that badge, and I can work in school. What the superintendent is talking about in the legislative change that we would like is to have what we discussed with PSPRS is if you leave on a Friday, that you can continue to work at that school. You're not punishing the school with all the relationships you have. How do we find a way with that officer that wants to continue working at school, but is separated from their home agency to continue to do so?
Thank you.
And we have fulfilled a number of the schools with the people working on their days off. Yes.
Wayne Chesky from KJZZ.
Can you talk a little louder, please?
Wayne Chesky from KJZZ.
You can't talk any louder.
I used to work for newspapers. You mentioned that, you've got members of both parties on this task force.
Yes.
But you obviously need, especially if you want an emergency clause in this legislation, you're gonna need a lot of people on board. Have you approached any of these proposals with other members of the legislature who haven't been a part of this leadership to kind of get a feel
I
on
didn't know that.
what the response is gonna be?
Wayne, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Wayne, we haven't done that yet. We've kept our work here in the task force. We wanted to respect the task force and the task force members as we unveiled all of the recommendations. Of course, the superintendent is amenable to doing that because we recognize we need bipartisan support to implement these changes, which is why also we approach it from a holistic standpoint. It isn't just about getting more officers in schools. It's about more counselors, more social workers, psychologists, more resources for our schools.
And I think involving legislators of both parties in equal amounts, I thought I had turned this off.
Doesn't play hail to the chief.
Not yet. There we go. I think involving legislators of both parties from day one, so they both have input into and then buy-in into the conclusion, is a model I'm very proud of. And I hope in other contexts, people copy that model because we need a lot more bipartisanship than we've had.
Has any members, have they given an indication they plan to sponsor this legislation?
We're not at that stage yet.
So let me come back to the other issue, which was the technology issue. Talking about AI that can spot guns and things
Oh,
like
just a
that.
second. I see Melissa nodding. Do you have a sponsor?
Yes, we do.
Who is it? Are you free to say?
I would like the draft to be produced for the sponsor to review before
Okay,
they announce it, but.
we do have a sponsor.
I figure out of 90 people, you could find somebody. Maybe the Republican. Let's come back to the technology. You talk about the issues there, what else can be done in terms of.
This is for you.
I'll talk hardening, if you will, the schools. Again, is this a problem with authorization, money, legislation? So what's the issue there? I mean, is this somehow adding to what, the building renewal fund is supposed to pay or something like that, which we know that funding's been a little shaky? I mean, what's the issue, why they can't do that now?
So we're specifically talking about the School Safety Program Fund, which is governed by 15154. Right now, that fund only covers positions. What we're proposing through legislation is to include additional positions, as I said, SSO and school psychologists, but also technology, target hardening tools such as ballistic film. This isn't about creating a prison environment. It's about how do we enhance safety? How do we enhance security on schools? And that's why I think the advent of AI technology, which is so cutting edge, is so critically important. Cameras are great, but they're only as good as somebody monitoring the camera. If you have an algorithm, if you have technology that can sense a threat, can identify that threat beforehand, that's a tool that I think everyone would agree has tremendous value, because especially in a critical incident at a school, seconds matter. And right now, the legislation doesn't allow for that.
So do we need more money in that? I mean, Tom, how much are you getting each year in that fund?
Well, we got $80 million, which I think is a fairly large amount, including federal and state, and that's all accounted for as long as we can fill the positions.
So, okay, but you're using it now to do these SROs. How much more do you need? Let's say my school district, Levine, decides we'd like some of this AI technology. How much more money, given we have 200 and some school districts around the state, I don't know how many schools, how much more money do you need in that fund to handle the kind of requests that might come in for this technology?
Number?
That's going to be a big number. There's no doubt about that. And then it depends, right, in terms of scalability, because there are layers of technology. If we talk about target hardening, there are systems out there that can automatically lock doors. There's ballistic systems beyond ballistic film. So it would be unfair of me to try and estimate what that is. But what I will say is what we know right now is we have money that is unused. So if there's an opportunity to, rather than just have it sit there, because it's beholden to positions, but use it for technology or other target hardening, we think that makes sense. And that's what we're proposing.
So how much is sitting in Tom's piggy bank at the moment?
On the school resource officer side alone, $18.6 million that's unused, that's been repurposed for the SSO model, portions of it. I mentioned that there were 148 school counselor and school social worker positions as well. We've had discussions about, is there a capacity, is there an ability to take this model or a similar model where we deploy off-duty officers to do it in a counselor social worker way? It doesn't appear that such a pathway currently exists, but we've talked about how can we do that. So in the meantime, you have positions that are unfilled and that funding could be used for other purposes.
Hand back there.
And building off that.
Could you talk up, please?
Sorry.
Talk up.
Yeah. So with the SSO, I know that you're proposing to change the language in the statute so that way it's codified in the law. But you've already started getting the ball rolling using some of the funds for the unused SROs. Can you explain a little bit about how you're able to use those funds now before that language has been changed?
So we worked, obviously the superintendent is a lawyer, and we worked with in-house counsel to confirm that anything we do comports with 15-154. And so what 15-154 now says that to use school safety program funds, it must be an officer or full authority reserve officer as certified by the Arizona Peace Officer Standards and Training Board. So whether you are a full-time SRO or a part-time SSO, you meet that criteria by statute. So that is then using those funds that are unused in this SSO capacity. Additionally, there's a federal grant, the Stronger Connections Grant, which preceded this model that we're using under the school safety program, where we're doing that with 62 schools around the state already, a strict off-duty model in schools.
I'd just like to say, Mike and I have been doing a lot of talking, and we have members of our group here that have worked very hard in committee. So if anybody else would like to say anything with respect to the questions that have been asked or anything else, please come up, because you guys are the ones that have done the hard work. I don't see any hands. Are there any other questions?
You're on the hook, Tom, so let's come back to the money.
And Mike, you do have one online question.
Oh, go ahead. Bobby said there's an online question. I'm sorry, Howard.
So we have the School Social Work Association of Arizona. They say they've heard a lot of talk how to find these unfilled SRO positions, but how are we addressing the unfilled school counselor and social worker positions?
The only way to address that would be for the legislature. We used all the entire 80 million we got. The legislation required us to give priority to any request for SROs, so we filled every request that we got for SROs. Then we filled all the remaining social worker requests for which we had money, and we have over 500 social workers we funded and over 300 SROs we funded. So we spent a lot more money on social workers than on SROs. But there were some social worker requests, the money ran out and we didn't have the money for them. And if the legislature decides to appropriate more money, we can fill those positions. I understand there's a deficit, so it may be hard to get that this year. I just want to say that K-12 education, including public schools, private schools, and ESAs, is at least $57 million below budget. So the budget deficit is not the fault of anything regarding ESAs or any part of our schools. I think that's a myth that's been propagated that needs to be contradicted. But other than that, if the legislature has money to appropriate, we can hire those additional social workers.
Well, let's come back to the money, Tom. What are you going to ask for? You say the legislature has.
We don't have a number, Howie. I thought Mike said that. We don't have a number yet.
Well, okay, but you've been a legislator, Tom.
Yeah.
The Attorney General. It is December 7th. Little session starting a month from today.
Yeah.
You're going to be in the budget talks. So when are you going to have a number to say, if we want to do these things, if we want to have these SSO programs, we want to have the additional 8 hours of training, we want to find money for folks, we want to be able to do school hardening that Mike talks about. TikTok.
Yeah, we don't have a number, and asking the same question over again won't get a different answer from me, Howie.
Maybe one
Was there
more
a hand back there?
I have a follow-up from my online question that I didn't get to ask.
Yes. Go ahead.
I am curious, because you said legislation required that school resource officers were filled first. That wasn't legislation, that was your decision. And right now, the number of positions that were.
Excuse me, let me interrupt you because it's a footnote on the
I'm
budget.
sorry, can I finish my question, sir?
Well, not if you're going to say things that aren't true. That was a footnote in the budget that said that we had to give priority to the SROs, and that was not my decision, that was a legislative decision. Now you can go ahead.
So now I'll share that legislation didn't say that, but thank you for trying to correct me. And school social workers and school counselors have more unfilled positions than school resource officers. And I have heard no talk about how we're going to fill those positions.
First of all, I have to repeat myself. There is a footnote in
I
the
did
budget.
too.
There's a footnote in the budget that requires that priority be given to SROs, okay? And I think the question about, and we have.
I agree a footnote in the budget was made, but that wasn't a legislative decision.
Footnotes are definitely legislative decisions, ma'am. And so, and we have funded over 500 social workers and over 300 SROs. We have said earlier that the only way to fund more social workers would be legislation, but we don't have a number at this point.
And Tarinda, if I may, I said in my presentation that we want to continue to work with the counselor and the social worker associations to find pathways to get more counselors and social workers in schools. That's where I'll defer to you and your expertise, working with institutions of higher learning, as I mentioned before, to find ways to feed them in there. I said, we're not done, we're not sunsetting, we're sunsetting the task force, but the work continues.
Any other questions? If not, thank you, everybody, and thank you especially to the members of the task force. It's very hard work that they did in committees, and we have certificates for you up here.
Thank you, everyone.
What, no donuts for them, just certificates? It's good to better than certificate, just some donuts for them at least?
Why is it gotta be donuts?
I don't know. Okay, I wasn't meant to be.
Donuts aren't healthy. We could get some lettuce and carrots.
Okay, how about bagels?
Bagel.
Whole wheat bagels, how about that?
Whole wheat, yeah.
That sounds good.